the first. So I'm Cristina Poncibo from the University of Turin, and I'm honored to introduce our speakers today. And also I'm pleased that the PhD program in Trento has been so kind to ask me to introduce our distinguished speakers today. I've been asked to be a little bit more formal here, and so I'm trying just to show you a very brief presentation, introduction of our speakers as far as I can. Today we are going to discuss within the seminars of the PhD program of a book. That has been already discussed in a number of very interesting conferences. I've been attending the Academic Society for Competition Law virtual conference 2020, so I had the pleasure to be online when the book has been presented in that occasion, and I really enjoyed the discussion there. While it has stimulated me various ideas and questions. So today our speakers are Professor Ariel Ezrachi, as law terme professor of competition law and a fellow of Pembroke College in Oxford. He has many academic engagements. He is also the co-editor-in-chief of a journal of antitrust enforcement that we are very interested to read over here, and many other publications, including the book that I would like to mention, Virtual Competition, and also this a number of other publications like you can see in the image the impressive publications of Professor Ezrachi. Then our second distinguished speaker is Professor Stuka, co-author of the book. Again, he has a number of academic prestigious engagements, is the co-founder of the Data Competition Institute, law professor of the University at Tennessee in the US, and he has many prestigious positions and research engagements as well. So we are really proud that you have accepted and honored again. I would like to stress this. We imagine how many engagements you may have in your research and teaching duties. So the book is Competition Overdose, How Free Market Mythology Transformed Us from Citizen Kings to Market Servants. Before I end this very brief introduction, I would like to say that I think we have to hold thank you, because you have been telling the truth. In the sense, as people in the field, as practitioners or scholars, we were already thinking that there were occasions over time where competition law has been such a sort of misapplication, over applications on. So we were thinking, we were noting cases that where we have, we were a little bit concerned about the practical results. So this is telling the truth. And so opened the floor to discuss this point, but leading this criticism and proposing the idea of a noble competition that we are keen to hear from you. So thank you very much. And I know you have a slide presentation that you would like to show to our students.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. Really appreciate it. So yes, let me share our slides, and we will begin with a presentation of some of the themes from the book. Of course, not all of them, but things that we think will be of interest to you. Yep. Are we? So can you all see the slides? Super.
Yes.
So indeed, the book tries to take a fresh look at the ideal of competition, something that shapes a lot of the environment that we see around us. And Maurice and I really thought hard about these things and the themes and the way in which, in many ways, competition, the ideal of competition, maybe evolved in ways that are not in line with its origin. Because when you look around you in the Western world, what you see is that competition, the idea that rivalry is the solution for most of our problems, became almost a religion belief. So many times, if there is a problem in the health sector, a problem in the education sector, the solution is, you know what, let's introduce competition, let's introduce more pressure, and the pressure will create rivalry, and that rivalry will help us. It will bring the best out of us and will provide us with a market reality that is better, greater welfare. And yet, if you look at the right side of the slide, I think most of us are in a rat race. We're basically, despite this promise that if only we just increase this pressure, the competitive pressure of competition, we will be better off. What many of us feel is that we're not better off. We're working longer hours. We're spending more time doing what we're told will bring us the welfare and the good life, and we're earning less. And this reality requires us to take quite a careful look at the competition ideal. And in many ways, we say that competition is like a medicine, and you can overdose on competition. Many times, competition is the perfect solution for our problems. And indeed, a lot of the environment we see around us, a lot of the innovation is the result of competition. Lower prices many times are the result of competition. But if you take that and you ignore the warning signs and you ignore the real characteristics of the competition machine, then what happens is that you quickly overdose. And this is what the book is about. It is about explaining that beyond the benefits of competition, the process has limitations. And because a lot of times we ignore the warning labels, what happens is that as we try to help society and we press for more competition, what we find ourselves is actually worse off. So let's move now to Maurice. Maurice, when is competition toxic and who should we blame?
All right, well, thank you. So the way that, you always hear about the power of three. Our book is actually divided in 4, 4, and 2. So the first part, we wanted to identify when competition can be toxic. And rather than just providing anecdotes, what we did was we looked at the assumptions underlying competition, and then what happens then when you relax some of those assumptions. And we come up then with 4 cases where competition can be toxic. And it really takes us an interesting route. We begin with hockey players who decide not to wear their helmets. Then we go then to the US university admissions scandal, where if you've been following it, parents are being sent to jail for bribing university officials to get their children into their school. And you could see the competitive pressure. And what we describe is a competition, a race to the bottom, where neither the university nor the students nor really the parents come out ahead. And then we go to areas of toxicity in our food, which Ariel will discuss, that you will be familiar with. And then we look then at behavioral exploitation, and we look at the latest in behavioral economics, and that takes us to the Trump hotels. And then finally, we come then to this area of competition overdose, and we look at Amazon and some of the practices that it's engaging in. And we also look then at online dating. So after we then identify the 4 scenarios where competition can be toxic, we then ask, who's pushing this, this toxic competition? And we were surprised because some of the people who we thought would give us the greatest pushback, like senior officials at the competition agencies, they were actually the most forthcoming. And they were very helpful in helping us identify other areas of competition overdose. So it wasn't the competition officials. Rather, we come up with 4 culprits. One of them is the ideologues. The others are the lobbyists. Then we come to the privatization. And then the final group, and probably the most sinister, are the game makers. These are the ones who create a competitive game in which we compete. And then they, regardless of who wins or loses, they come out always ahead. And this is like from the Hunger Games, you know, you have the various combatants, and it doesn't really matter ultimately who wins. It's that the elite benefit as a result of that competition. So after we then identify the 4 culprits, we then ask, how do we get out of this? How do we reorient competition from when it's toxic to something better? And so the first question that we ask is, what is competition? And what we find is that competition is not static, but there's a spectrum, and we'll go over that today. And then what we find that if toxic competition is at one end of the spectrum, what would be at the other? What would be the sort of a platonic ideal? And that's where we come up with noble competition, and we'll describe what that is. And then if noble competition is the ideal, what can we do as a society, both the government, companies, as well as individuals, to reorient competition from toxic to something noble? And we'll give you some of the insights in our book on that. So let's go now to our first example of toxic competition. It's something that will be known to Europeans near and dear. Ariel.
Yeah, so really to illustrate how we can move from beneficial competition to harmful overdose, let's look at the food sector. And this is the Horsegate scandal that, of course, many Europeans remember, when many of us realized that when you bought your favorite beef lasagna, you were actually eating horse meat, and that a lot of the food that was described as 100% beef included many additives, in some cases, even up to 100% horse meat or pig meat rather than the promised beef. And why do we use that as an example? Because it is a very simple example of what happens when you increase. If you look at the boilers, there is an image here of boilers. If you increase the pressure in the competition boiler. So we had a little bit of an economic downturn. There was a lot of pressure on price, and supermarkets were competing fiercely against each other, trying to offer us, the consumers, the best price possible. In turn, what do? They start applying pressure upstream to their suppliers. Their suppliers apply pressure upstream to their beef providers. And the assumption is that, I mean, in that story, in the traditional competition story, this is a perfect story, because this is what will lead us to buy beef lasagna at a lower price. And why is that working? Because we have certain assumptions in the competition machine. We assume that when you eat a beef lasagna, you are sophisticated enough to identify that it is beef. We assume that companies are very worried of you realizing that they are cheating or undercutting the quality, and so they will refrain from doing it. And we also assume that if one company is selling for very cheaply, but is doing so by selling you horse meat, another company will be able to communicate that to you very quickly. And so the market actually works. So in an ideal world, when you increase the competitive pressure, it should deliver greater welfare. But we all realize that that has not been the case. And why? Because we as consumers don't always identify quality. Because sometimes when your option as a seller is to downgrade quality or maybe go out of business, then you take the hard decision to start cheating. You take the hard decision of putting some more horse meat into the supply chain. And because supermarkets have many pressures and they will not always be equipped to check the quality of the food. And the food industry or the food standard authorities also only sometimes engage in very serious examination. So this is a very simple example that just highlights how competitive pressure works in our favor. But if you overdose, and when you overdose, you don't put in place safety mechanisms, you don't put in place quality control, what you will get is not greater welfare, you will get the opposite. Now, some of you might say, yeah, but I don't eat frozen lasagnas, and B, I'm actually thinking of becoming a vegetarian, so this doesn't affect me. But the important thing is to understand that this Horsegate scandal that led to us eating meat is not one anecdote that you just tell and you say, okay, so rarely it will happen. This is something that you will see all around you. And it stems from our illusion that the competition machine is independent and will always deliver. Whereas in reality, if you do not appreciate the limitations of the competition machine, it will fail to deliver. You have to start supporting the competitive machine, otherwise it will backfire. And another brief example that highlights that is something that, of course, we all heard about, the tragedy of the two 737 MAX that crashed. And that there are many reasons for that crash. But that story can also be told as a story of competition overdose. And once you speak to the engineers, you realize that this was the result of fierce competition between Boeing and Airbus. And the instruction that was given to the engineers was design a new airplane that will not require new training for pilots, so we can get a few contracts instead of those contracts going to Airbus. And that pressure was so significant that eventually they released an airplane without informing the pilots about a certain program. And the reason this was never informed publicly was that if this was part of the official upgrade, then you should have had a training, a much more robust training for pilots, and this would have changed the deal. So again, competitive pressure led to that. And from the other end, you see, you had the safeguards. You have the Federal Aviation Administration in the US. Surely they should have seen that. But no, because our trust in competition is so overwhelming, the FAA actually outsourced its role to check the safety of Boeing to Boeing. Boeing basically stamp its own work and say, this is in line with your requirements. So again, we see what happens when we take the narrative of competition and we start running with it, and we ignore all the warning labels that actually economists would suggest we should be aware of. Let's move now, Maurice, to a different angle of this story, the game makers.
All right, so the game makers, as I mentioned, can create a competitive process where you have groups of entities that compete, but then regardless of who wins and loses, they will always come out on top. So the simplest one is the Hunger Games. Then you start wondering, well, is there anything like that in real life? Well, you have reality TV shows like Survivor or The Amazing Race, where you could see that the contestants are like in this maze, each trying to outdo the other. And you can manipulate the game to maybe favor one or the other, but ultimately it doesn't really matter which contestant wins, because the primary winners are going to be the producers of the show, who will then have the advertising revenue. So then we took that one step further and we say, well, who else would be the game makers around us? And here we came to Google and Facebook. Now, Google and Facebook are the architects of the online display advertising ecosystem. and also the online search ecosystem. And this has attracted a significant amount of attention. That you had the Australian Competition Authority came out with its report, as well as the CMA, and it was really the French Competition Authority that had a first look. So what we did then was we looked at all the publicly available sources, and we wanted to look at how Google and Facebook designed this ecosystem and the way that they have a lot of competition that they can point to, on like Google, for example, can point to the millions of websites on the one hand that are competing for advertising revenue. And then on the other hand, you have millions of advertisers that are bidding against one another in order to place ads on the next page that we would likely see on the internet. And it looks robustly competitive. In fact, Google and Facebook in the inquiries to the CMA point out that, this is, the picture of competition. Look at all of these intermediaries. Look at all of the advertisers. Look at all of the publishers. Also, they point out advertising costs have gone down 40%. So this is the sort of picture of competition. But once you peek under the hood, then you realize that there is this online tax, and Google and Facebook extract a lot of money. That they extract, Google as an intermediary gets anywhere between 30 and 35 cents on every dollar. And so what we find is that the game makers can create the system first where they work with the publishers to addict us. So there are two key mechanisms in this game: competition for our attention and competition for our data. And so the game makers help the publishers. And we look at this children's game app that got in trouble. And Google was there to help the children's game app help children get onto the app, to play the game, and to extract data on the children. And so first, they help them addict us. Second, they help the publishers extract the data, because data here, as we all know, is valuable, particularly for display advertising. And that data then is funneled to the game maker. And then the game maker, when it has that data, and behavioral advertising brings significantly higher revenues than just contextual advertising, they use that data then to attract bidders. And bidders then will if they know, for example, that the child is interested in buying a new toy, then that will attract more bidders into the frenzy in order to target that child with advertisements for that toy. And this goes on 24/7, that every time you're going on to a new website, there's a new display ad. Behind the scenes, the game makers are orchestrating this this advertising network, and the intermediaries as well, to determine what ads will appear before us. And as the head of the top antitrust official in Europe, Margaret Vestager, pointed out, that they're now becoming the center of the large empires. And this is precisely an area where the US is likely to bring an antitrust suit in the coming weeks, as well as the states. So we have here the game makers. They obviously are pushing for this toxic competition because they're benefiting. But Ariel will then tell us who else is pushing this toxic competition.
Yes, so as Maurice explained at the beginning, we look at various groups that, while being aware that they are pushing for competition which is harmful to society, are creating a facade and lobbying for more competition because it benefits them. The one story that we want to share with you now is just the one of privatization. And our interest in privatization is not the whole process of privatization. Of course, we all benefit many times when there are services that used to be provided by the state and are now subject to competition. And there's no doubt about that. So this is not us questioning the value or merit of privatization as such, but it is to highlight how sometimes when you have markets that just don't work, when they are privatized, still what you will have is a lot of pressure to privatize them. And that pressure is being managed using the competition ideal. So prisons in the US are a very illustrative example, because what you have are prisons that are managed by private firms, and those firms are bidding for contracts from the government. And there used to be only state and federal prisons in the US. And then at some point, because of limitations of the state system and the federal system, some of the activity went into private sector. And then at the end of the Obama administration, there was already a decision to start and limit the use of private prisons. And yet, now under the Trump administration, there is much more pressure to increase privatization. So if we take a short quiz, there are 3 questions here. And basically, think for a second. Which of these statements is true? Private prisons provide the same level of services, security, quality as public prisons. They provide better rehabilitation services, and they have the same interest as society to limit crime. Which of these statements do you think is true? The answer, as you would expect, is none of them. And the reason being that they actually profit from there being more people using the private prisons. So what we have is a massive anomaly. We have lobbying that is pushing for more competition in areas where the private sector provides an inferior product to the public sector. We have stories from the US where private prisons, they punish the inmates by actually forcing them to stay longer periods in jail. They do not invest in any rehabilitation services because it doesn't serve their interests. And we even have stories of corruption and trying to affect judgments by convincing judges to send people to jail, to spend more time in jail. So again, this is one example of this crazy anomaly that we have. And this is an example from the US. We have examples when it comes to privatization of healthcare, for example, in many states across Europe, you have these stories. And part of it is what we refer to as cream skimming. What happens is, let's take healthcare as an example. If you have a private hospital and a public hospital, the private hospital only takes the best cases that make the most money. And if someone gets into very significant complications, the private sector then sends that person to the public hospital. And if they need more blood that they store, they actually get it from the public sector. And if they need an ambulance, they get it from the public sector. So when you look at the data, what you will see is, wow, private hospitals are so efficient. They are so much better than the public hospitals. But if you understand cream skimming, what you see is that the picture is much more nuanced. Public hospitals have to, most of the time, treat people with illnesses that will never get any treatment in a private hospital. They are required to store blood supply, medicine beyond what is efficient. They're required to have beds that they don't need to use over the summer. So this is not an argument against private hospitals. This is an argument against the idea that when you take a snapshot and when you see a private entity being more efficient than a public entity, this is not the end of the inquiry. This is just the beginning. You have to then look very carefully and get a sense of why is it. And many times the picture is actually much more complex. And in some industries that we discuss in the book, we show that privatization that is driven by the ideal of competition is actually backfiring. And Maurice, maybe you want to tell us basically about the source of privatization.
Right. So, well, what we say is that privatization, like competition, can often be good, but it's not always good. So if the incentives are misaligned, it won't work out. So we began, one of the nice things about writing a book is you can then start saying, well, where did the term come from? And so we wanted to know the origin of the word privatization. And our initial thoughts were probably was either Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, right? Because this is where a lot of the government is bad, private sector is good mentality came from. But it turns out that they did not coin the phrase. We have to go a little bit earlier. And who else but the Nazis? So what we find here is that a Harvard, a Radcliffe actually, a PhD student was studying the German economy. And what she coined, she was the first person to do so, was Reprivatisierung, which was basically the Germans needed to have the endorsement of the powerful firms in Germany. And in order to get them on board, what they promised to do was to take, like, let's say the state monopolies and transfer them over to the private parties. And here you could see how the term privatization has really emerged from a concept where the assets would be transferred to benefit the few at the expense of many, to now become, privatization benefits many at the expense of few, right? That privatization will provide us choice, will provide us competition, will promote autonomy. And that can be at times true. But at times, the government will privatize, knowing exactly that it may not work, precisely either to benefit a few or to get a problem off its shoulders, and then to blame then the private agents and say, they're the ones that are messed up. But let's continue.
So after we spend time in our second part of the book, and what we discuss here is just privatization, we also talk about lobbyists, we talk about pressure groups, ideologues. Then we ask, what can we do about it? Because once you have this understanding, the realization that we're dealing with a medicine that can easily become toxic, okay, so we understand that. We have a better understanding of this instrument that we all use daily. How can we judge it better? And what we do is to try and help us appreciate different scenarios. We created a spectrum. And on one side, we have toxic competition. This is competition where the process harms the players, harms society. And this is something all of us would like to avoid. Then we have zero-sum competition that is motivated, of course, by self-interest. And many times, this is the only type of competition you can have. If I bid for a house and Maurice bid for the same house, this might be just the reality we're in. Ideally, we can have a positive sum competition, something which is more ethical. But this is also when we came up with the idea that as a country, as a society, if we needed to think about something that we ought to aspire to, this should be noble competition. Now, to be clear, we're thinking of noble competition the way you would think about the model of perfect competition, something that you might not achieve on a daily basis, but as a society, something that if you have it on your spectrum, it really helps you crystallize your mind and understand what is the type of competition that you would like to see around you. And Maurice will explain a little bit more about this concept of noble competition.
All right. So the way that we came up with our spectrum, you might say, well, how did you judge where the different forms of competition should lie along the spectrum? And how did you come up then with noble competition? Well, we had two questions. And the first question is competition serving us? Is this form of competition serving us? Or are we serving competition? And then the second question is, to what extent does competition ennoble us rather than degrade us? To what extent is competition getting the best out of us rather than bringing out our worst? So if we have then toxic competition, which flunks both questions, right? That competition, we're serving it, it doesn't serve us. And it really it can bring out our worst rather than our best. What would then be the opposite? And here it's something counterintuitive. It's competition where you're helping your rivals achieve their best. Now that sounds counterintuitive, and it was counterintuitive for us. And when we mentioned it at first, one of our friends said, "Oh, this is like the lysine cartel," where, if you recall from the movie The Informant, the DOJ actually taped ADM, and one of the executives from ADM said, "You know, my customers aren't my friends. You are my friends. You know, the competitors are my friends. The customers are my enemy." And so isn't what you're really proposing as noble competition just cartels? Because that's basically it, right? Their rivals are their friends. The customer is the enemy. And we struggled with this. But when we got to the game makers chapter, it offered us then a way out. We said, what if you were to design the game? How would you design the competition? And it would probably be the same way as when you have children and your children compete. You would want each child to push the other so that each of them are getting then their best. So a mutual striving of excellence. And then when you as a society do that, you want your then competitors to get the best from each other. So once we then had that breakthrough, we said, all right, if society, if our policymakers want to reorient competition from toxic to noble, what are some of the things that they can do? And we find that each of us can have a role to play. So first is the state. And as Ariel pointed out, the state could have a role first in putting sufficient guardrails to prevent competition from being toxic. So when you have a pressure cooker, like a boiler that Ariel referred to, and you continually increase pressure, well, what's going to happen? Some of those bolts will pop, and those bolts will be either horse meat in our food, pollutants in our air and water, and also human slavery and degraded work conditions. So we need to then watch the competition machine. We need to ensure that we're not just exporting jobs to countries where they exploit human labor, because that's not really promoting noble competition. But there's also an important role for the state to provide what competition cannot provide. And so here, the competition authorities were really good. They said, look, competition can provide you the efficient end, but competition doesn't necessarily provide the just end, that there will be a gap. There's some things that competition cannot provide. And we then talk in our book about how the state has an important role to play, that there's, for example, a safety net to provide us the essential freedoms, including the freedom of want. And then we then look at industry's role. And here, we look at maximizing shareholder value, why, companies aren't limited to that, and how it's actually counterproductive. That we find that from the research that companies that maximize values other than shareholder value actually do better than those that just simply try to maximize shareholder value for their shareholders. But we also look at what happens when companies unleash competition within their firms. What happens when you have employees pitted against employees? And sometimes companies say, well, competition is so good, let's have our divisions compete against one another. And we come up with some really good toxic examples of how that can backfire. And then finally, we look at our own role. And you might say, what can I do? I mean, particularly in the United States right now, you look at the United States and you've got this quagmire and you're like, what is it that I can do? How can I really change any of this? I mean, I'm just an unwilling participant. And we cite the Milgram studies, where, if you recall, it's studies on obedience. We find how the power of dissent can be really important. And we look then at how one or two single voices can have a significant impact. For example, in really launching in the United States, an important privacy statute, the California Consumer Privacy Act. But we also then look at how we can also affect change through our purchasing decisions. And we look at the farmers market and how the farmers market can really represent a way of rethinking about competition and how what do we value when we make our purchases? And we go into some length about that. So in the end, we actually have a very positive message about how we can change things around us for the better. And then also we say this book came out pre-COVID, but then Ariel, do you want to just say a couple things about the application post-COVID?
Yes. So this has been very, very topical around March and April. I think where you really, unfortunately, saw examples of the way in which toxic competition ruins everything. So we saw, for instance, toxic competition in the US as different states were fighting for ventilators and outbidding each other. And the federal government, instead of stepping in and actually monitoring and making sure that this will be a competition that benefits all, actually allowed that to happen. And that was something that is when you see it, it really makes you appreciate. The competition should be about creating some welfare. All it did was actually extract more value from countries as they were fighting each other. And that's a good example of toxic competition. We also saw, I think, really good explanations to what happens when you over-rely on the competition ideal and you underfund the public health service. Now, I think in terms of formal state health service, go back 10 months, most of the health services were underfunded. And to some extent, part of it was the competition ideal. So again, you see that the argument that you need to be efficient, if you're efficient, you'll have only one ventilator per so-and-so people. Sometimes in society, it's not just about efficiency. It's not just about competition. Sometimes you need to make certain investments that are inefficient, wasteful even, but are the right thing. But we also saw examples of noble competition, early days of trying to understand exactly the way the virus operates. You had a lot of collaboration between scientists that was quite inspiring, because usually in academia, you will be very careful before you collaborate because it's about who gets the credit. So you try to publish first. And a lot of those who are really crucial to our moving out of this crisis were collaborating in a way that put the greater good ahead of their own self-interest. And there is something quite noble about that, and something that we should probably all appreciate. So in a way, we were part of a social experiment. Unfortunately, I think we still are, where we saw some of the limitations of the competitive process, but also some of the benefits. So hopefully this gave you a little bit of an overview of some of the themes that we cover in the book. I hope you enjoyed that.
All right. So is there a good?
So thank you very much indeed. I think all students, all colleagues have really enjoyed. It has been quite an inspiring description of the book that is full of ideas. So the PhD seminar is an opportunity to let a PhD student and candidate to present some ideas, to intervene. So if for you is you are available, we would like to give floor to the candidate, Dr. Andrea Piletto Massaro, who has been organizing the whole seminar, the meeting, and so we are really thankful for Andrea. So, Andrea, would you like to add something to open the discussion?
Of course, and thank you for giving me the floor. First of all, I would like to thank our outstanding guests for their presentation and their participation at this webinar. I read the book Competition Overdose in March, just after its publication, and I then watched a web presentation delivered in May at the Collège d'Europe, and I thought having them here, having Professor Ezraci and Stuka here would have been great. Now the dream has come true, and that's thanks to their kind availability. And I also cannot hide the emotion because that's one of my first public presentations, and being the same panel as Professors Ezraci, Poncibo, and Stuka is really challenging. But now let's turn to our topic, that is toxic competition. I would start by asking myself, our guests, and the audience, like in the book, what is competition? Personally, I remain fascinated by such concept, which is also our research field, during the first years of my university studies. Basically, what attracted me was the fact that in a competitive economic field, companies could develop better products, advance innovation, and finally deliver an outcome that makes us, as both consumers and citizens, better off. After that, I focused my graduation thesis on private antitrust enforcement. And for those of you who are not so familiar with competition law, private enforcement indicates the lawsuits that private citizens and consumers can file in order to seek damages arising out of a competition law infringement. That sounds so powerful, a consumer who can file a lawsuit against a corporate giant. In the end, what I mean is that I was really attracted by how competition can deliver a very well-functioning market in the interest of citizens and consumers. That is for the sake of clarifying that I am a supporter of competition. So you may wonder why I'm here to talk about toxic competition and overdoses of competition. The reason is that after such idealization of competition, when I graduated and I walked out in the real world, I noticed that some promises delivered by competition ideologies as well as politicians are not quite matching the everyday reality because I saw a lot of toxic competition. Then, when I was admitted at the University of Trento's PhD school, I started thinking about the fallacies of competition when interpreted through the lens of excessive economic laissez-faire. I was trying to find a stimulating subject for my dissertation, and during a conversation with my supervisor, we asked ourselves, why is competition so focused on price? Why other criteria such as quality are only considered as second-tier factors? In a nutshell, why such a race to the bottom with the only aim of reducing prices? However, when I started researching, I have been doubtful on this topic for a long time, because if you read through outstanding antitrust ideologies, speeches, and publications, you end up thinking that competition is always good and beneficial to us. But some questions did remain unsolved. Among them, so why the economic crisis, for instance? Why the rise in inequality rates? And just for the sake of clarity, I will provide some astonishing but not really surprising data. The OECD has reported that income inequality in OECD countries, which includes Italy, the US, UK, France as well, etc., is at its highest level for the past half century. Moreover, the report revealed that the average income of the richest 10% of the population is about 9 times that of the poorest 10% across the OECD. up from 7 times 25 years ago. In the United States, data show that the top 0.1% of the population accounts for about the wealth of the bottom 90%. As the book we are discussing about outlines, a Federal Reserve Board study reports that 40% of Americans would face serious financial difficulties in case should they face a $400 unexpected expense. Do you think this is only an American nightmare, not leaking the European coasts of the Atlantic Ocean? You might revise your belief when knowing that Credit Suisse reported that the richest 7 million people in Europe account as much wealth as the poorest 662 million ones. Do you think our beautiful Italy is immune? Please note that between 2009 and 2013, the percentage of people suffering severe material deprivation increased by more than 10%. So why this happens if we are living in a perfect and rational competitive environment as sponsored by ideologists and politicians? They probably end up answering this question by prescribing much more competition. But is it the right cure? I'll not give an immediate answer, but I would like to go through one of the mostly debated issues in the current antitrust literature, where a milestone is represented by the volume Virtual Competition by Professors Esrachi and Stacchi. I'm referring to the digital world. Let's start by thinking about such meeting. I bought the book Competition Overdose on Amazon, and I have it delivered the day after the order. I emailed our guests using Google's Gmail, and you're watching this event via YouTube, which is also owned by Google. I promoted the event on Microsoft's LinkedIn and also on Instagram, which in turn is owned by Facebook. And maybe you're watching this event on your brand new Android smartphone or tablet, or if you're more traditional, on your Chrome web browser. But do you know which company launched Android OS and Chrome? Well, it's still Google. What I want to underline with this brief description is that it seems like almost in every activity we carry out when interacting with the same powerful firms. You might think I'm outlining an obvious aspect of our everyday life, and I can agree with you, but is this so obvious? You might also point out that I benefited from a lot of services, maybe you could say free services. Yes, indeed, I never paid a fee for using Gmail, as well as I've always enjoyed Instagram for free. Yes, I only paid my annual Amazon Prime fee, but it's worth paying at 36 euros a year for free, fast delivery, movies on Amazon Prime Video, and so on. So what's wrong? We are living in a heaven-like environment with a lot of commodities for free. But so why have Google, Amazon, and Facebook opted to be for-profit companies instead of charities? Because they make profits, and lots of them. So how do they make profits? Just like the book Competition Overdose clearly explains, it's because we are working for them. Just to address the point simply, have you ever read till the end of the boring privacy policies that every website and app asked you to approve? I think none of us did. What we do is only scrolling fast till the end of the document, agree, and finally use our app. When we pass through that boring privacy policy, we have just agreed with the processing of our personal data, but the company which requested our consent. What will such a company ever do with our data? In the end, what harm may we suffer by agreeing on providing our name, location, preferences, just to list few items? Well, such companies will sell our personal information to advertisers. This is how they make profits. So are our beloved free services still free? Certainly not. But we don't pay with euro, pounds, or dollars, but with a different currency that is our personal data. In brief, why might these flows of data harm us? Let's make it simple. Imagine you're surfing the internet and you're planning to buy your next car and a good suit. So you surf your favorite car maker's website and your favorite suits label webpage in search for your new deals. Then, because you love reading news, you log also into the New York Times website. What happens? Why is the New York Times website full of cars advertisement? And why is your favorite suits label mailing you in the promotions section of your Gmail box? The answer, with an Orwellian flavor, lies in the words of the German competition authorities chair, Andreas Mundt, and it is because a big tech giant knows you better than your wife. As a consequence, yes, we do enjoy good services for an apparent zero or nominal price, because the parameter that has been worsened, inter alia, is the quality of our privacy. So free cheese is only in the mousetrap. This is enough stuff in order to start being a little frightened, but let's take another step. I represented above that such big companies can be counted on a hand's fingers, but they are so powerful. The sum of it means a lot of market power in the hand of few firms, which consequently leads to market concentration. According to Nobel Prize for Economy laureate Professor Joseph Stiglitz, market power has, of course, distributive effects as well. The monopoly strengths come at the expense of consumers. As monopolies raise their prices, their profits increase, while the well-being of consumers and workers decreases. An increase in market power is associated with an increase in inequality. And I could add that an excessive market power in few hands can also damage our democratic system, because it can translate into political power, for instance, through lobbying, or more worryingly, thinking about tech giants, by selecting the news you can find on your Facebook homepage, thus addressing your political views. Think about elections with little percentage rates between the two candidates. And in the end, what about market players, which are not game makers, as called by our guest book, but have to compete in a market environment designed by such game makers? This is why some sort of intervention is much needed. But what competition law can do in order to tackle inequalities or excessive concentration? Some argue that this is not a task for competition law, that fairness, whatever it means, is not an argument in the competition law discourse. They also argue that other means, such as tax law and regulation, are more suitable in order to reach this purpose. Of course, competition, also in its noble form, is not the cure for everything. In fact, competition law is a highly technical subject which shall be applied accordingly. However, here is where we shall ask another fundamental question, and it is, what should the goals of competition law be? The debate around the goals of competition law is what we can define a very academic battlefield. In some, after the advent of the so-called Chicago School, represented by its leading figure, Judge Robert Bork, author of the Antitrust Paradox, the ultimate goal of competition law shall be consumer welfare. But what the expression consumer welfare means is another debated topic. However, the core of the Chicago School assumptions was that competition law must promote economic efficiency. Such concept must be declined under neoclassical economic theories, where consumers are intended as perfectly rational. However, behavioral economics, as deeply explained in Competition Overdoses pages, shows that consumers are not guided by rationality only. Contrariwise, they are often irrational and driven by bias, emotions, widely intended. And the big companies know this in deep, and they also profit from these consumers' weaknesses, as clearly pointed out in the third and the fourth overdoses explained by our guests. It is also worth pointing out that in the European Union, for instance, a lot of ink is now flowing about the concept of fairness in EU competition law, as well as with regard to competition law and sustainability. With reference to the latter, I have in mind a very interesting article written by the Competition Tribunal member Simon Holmes about competition law and climate change. In particular, Holmes anchors his interpretation on the existing provision of the EU treaties. This, I think, is quite remarkable because what does competition law share with climate change or sustainability issues? Apparently nothing. So why such an outstanding competition law practitioner advanced such theory? I never spoke to Holmes, so I don't know the exact answer. However, I tried to solve such a doubt by myself after reading that article. And my supposed answer is because in order to tackle new competition law issues, we need new lenses. But the framework, at least in the European Union, is quite well structured, apart from the particular tools that will be needed, but I will return later on them. In particular, we have to think that competition rules are not a system which lives of its own light. With reference to Europe, competition law provisions are part of our national legal systems, which must comply with our constitutions. The same applies to EU law, which shall be adherent to the founding values and the Nice Charter. Moreover, and remarkably, in these systems, there is no space for an absolute laissez-faire approach. Think about Article 41 of the Italian Constitution, or the social market economy provision referred to in Article 3 of the Treaty on the European Union. Moreover, our constitutional framework guarantees a lot of other rights, like education and healthcare for all, which consequently cannot be pulled apart by the gospel asking for more liberalization. Such point is well addressed in the book we're reviewing, with reference to the privatization of some healthcare services in the UK, as well as the water supply service. In conclusion, when I read Competition Overdose, I finally found the answer I needed to the doubts that I expressed at the beginning of this presentation, this speech. And above all, I felt so less lonely in my doubtful thoughts about the current state of competition. But now what to do? Something seems to move. In the US, a filing is expected to be brought against Google, but we will see if it is a committed effort or a move in light of the forthcoming presidential elections. An interesting article published in the New York Times some days ago raises some doubts regarding the hurry in concluding the relevant investigation. In the EU, thanks to the remarkable direction of Commissioner Vestager, the EU seems to be ready for addressing tech giants and excessive market concentration, especially by means of the mysterious forthcoming new tool that has been announced in June. At the national level, various reports have been published by the major competition authorities. I'm referring to the reports published by the German Bundeskartellamt, the French Autorité de la Concurrence, the Italian AGCM, and the UK CMA. Furthermore, it's worth highlighting that the Autorité de la Concurrence fined Google in 2019. The AGCM announced 3 days ago an investigation on cloud computing against Google, Apple, and Dropbox. And maybe the most famous item, the Bundeskartellamt sanctioned Facebook in 2019 in a decision which adopted an innovative approach In fact, briefly, the German authority used the illicit extraction of personal data as a parameter for assessing a competition law infringement carried out by a dominant player. Consumers were left with the apparent choice between giving consent to Facebook over data extracted from other apps like WhatsApp and Instagram, as well as third parties' websites, or not using Facebook at all. More remarkably, the German authority was innovative also with regard to the sanction inflicted. Indeed, among other things, it required Facebook to provide its services also to users not agreeing with the extraction of data to be used for ads on Facebook from apps and websites other than Facebook itself. The need for remedies other than fines was underlined by the Bundeskartellamt's chair, Andreas Mundt, in various occasions. Indeed, it's very easy to imagine the pointless effect of a pecuniary fine on a firm with ever-increasing revenues in the scale of billions. Such decision, furthermore, was upheld in June 2020 by a judgment released by the German Federal Court of Justice. In the end, the authors of the book, relying on Professor Ezraci's sponge-like image of competition law, suggest an approach which considers also social-oriented issues as goals for reaching a noble form of competition instead of a greedy, toxic one. This, at the very end, regards the quality of our democratic societies. Indeed, citing an inspiring TED talk delivered by a philosopher and Harvard professor Michael Sandel, the question of markets is not merely an economic question. It's really a question of how we want to live together. Do you want a society where everything is up for sale, or are there certain moral and civil goods that markets do not honor and money cannot buy? Thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thank you, Andrea, for your presentation. I don't know if our distinguished guests are willing to comment. I think we all enjoyed the presentation of the book, and we hope to have the opportunity to discuss further in conferences about this. Let me call it the political stake of competition law openly. Indeed, this is my understanding, that we are talking of values that should be relevant and in the near future. So it would be great to know how novel competition may have an impact on remedies, let's say. I don't know if our guest would like to comment before we open for questions, and then we end the session.
Just to congratulate Andrea for the presentation, and I think you connected it very well to wider themes, which Maurice and I are both aware of, and this is something that has been occupying us for a while. So it's nice to see that you discuss it so nicely and offer some fresh ideas on other directions that are relevant here.
Yeah, I mean, it's very nicely done. I mean, it was almost like these strand of pearls and all of these different concepts that are now floating out there in the competition world. You brought it very nicely together in your presentation. So thank you very much for a very thoughtful presentation.
Okay, Andrea, would you like to say something, or we can end the session? Just a personal comment. You mention the point of public and private hospitals. I'm Italian, and I'm based in Turin, and we have been seriously hurted by COVID-19, as you have read. And in the country, as a reaction after this awful experience, we have been able to understand the importance of public hospitals. So for some years, we have been cutting sources to public hospitals. But after the great work they did for all the people, it doesn't matter your class, you know, we as a country, we understood the value. So we are an example of the distinction between the private hospitals and the public, in the sense that now we fully acknowledge the value of our national health service.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would like to really thank you for being with us this afternoon for this PhD seminar in law. And thank you. And I hope to have the possibility to hear from developments about Nobel competition.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.